They were told it was a shortcut to paradise. They were promised a land of milk and honey. But 87 pioneers found something else in the Sierra Nevada mountains. They found the limit of the human soul. They found that when hunger strips away civilization, your neighbor isn't a friend, they are a meal. Today, we open the forbidden journals of the Donner Party. We aren't just talking about a tragedy, we are talking about a descent into madness that Google Trends shows America is still obsessed with over 150 years later. Put on your coat. It's about to get very cold. Welcome to the archive. In April 1846, the spirit of manifest destiny was burning through the United States. Families from Illinois and Iowa packed their entire lives into covered wagons. Among them were the Donners and the Reeds, wealthy, optimistic, and dangerously unprepared. They were met with a pamphlet by a man named Lansford Hastings. He spoke of a new route, a cutoff, that would shave weeks off their journey. Experienced mountain men warned them, don't take it. Stick to the known trail. But James Reed, a man of pride, insisted. He believed the shortcut was the key to their fortune. What they didn't know was that Lansford Hastings had never actually traveled the route with wagons. He was selling a dream built on a lie. The shortcut turned into a nightmare almost immediately. Instead of a smooth path, they found the Great Salt Lake Desert. The heat was an oven. The ground was a crust of salt that collapsed under the weight of the wagons. Oxen died of thirst. Thirst turned into hallucinations. It took them 6 days to cross a desert they were told would take 2. By the time they reached the base of the Sierra Nevada mountains, the group was exhausted, their supplies were nearly gone, and their morale was shattered. And then, the first snowflake fell. It was October 31st. They were only a few miles from the summit. If they had reached it 1 day earlier, they would have descended into the warm valleys of California. But the clouds turned black. A storm, the likes of which the mountains hadn't seen in half a century, descended upon them. 5 feet of snow fell in a single night. Then 10. Then 20. The wagons were buried. The pioneers tried to push through, but the snow was like powdered sugar, there was no footing. They were trapped. They built crude shelters out of pine branches and ox hides near Truckee Lake. They thought it would last a week. They were wrong. It would last 5 months. Starvation is not a quick process. It is a slow erosion of the mind. First, they ate the remaining oxen. Then, they killed their loyal dogs. When the meat ran out, they boiled the ox hides. The hides turned into a thick, glue-like mucus that had almost no nutritional value but filled the stomach with a heavy, nauseating weight. Mothers watched their children's eyes sink into their skulls. Men who were once strong leaders began to weep like infants. The cold was constant, -30 degrees, seeping through the gaps in their log cabins. They were surrounded by millions of pine trees, but they were too weak to chop wood. They sat in the dark, listening to the sound of each other's shallow breathing. In December, 15 people, the strongest remaining, made a pact. They would walk out or die trying. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. They had no food. On the 6th day of their trek, a blizzard trapped them in a camp of death. One man, Patrick Dolan, went mad from the cold. He stripped off his clothes and ran into the snow, laughing. When he died, the others looked at his body. The pact was broken. They didn't want to do it. They wept as they carved the meat from the bones of their friends. They labeled the pieces of meat so that no one would have to eat their own relative. Among the Forlorn Hope were two Native American guides, Salvador and Luis. They were the only ones who refused to touch human flesh. When they saw the pioneers looking at them with hollow, predatory eyes, they knew they were next. They fled into the freezing woods. But the pioneers hunted them down. They were shot in the back of the head. Their bodies provided the strength for the survivors to reach a settlement in California. This is the dark secret that many history books try to hide, the cold-blooded murder of the only two people who tried to maintain their humanity. Back at the main camps, things were even worse. The Donner family was stuck at Alder Creek. George Donner was dying of gangrene. His wife, Tamsin, refused to leave his side, even when rescue was possible. When the first relief party arrived in February, they were greeted by a scene from a nightmare. A woman climbed out of a hole in the snow, the entrance to a buried cabin, and asked, "Are you men from heaven, or are you from the earth?" The rescuers found human limbs hanging from the trees like smoked ham. They found children sitting on the floor, chewing on the fingers of their playmates. The Reed family, miraculously, all survived. Virginia Reed, only 12 years old, later wrote a letter that became famous in American history. She said, "Remember, never take no cutoffs and always hurry along as fast as you can." But the scars stayed with them. They were social outcasts in California. People whispered when they walked by. "There go the cannibals," they would say. They had survived the mountain, but they could never survive the judgment of the living. Psychologists today study the Donner Party to understand the survival paradox. Why did some families, like the Reeds, stay together and survive, while others turned on each other? It comes down to the social contract. Once the first person is eaten, the contract is dead. The group ceases to be a community and becomes a collection of individuals fighting for a few more hours of life. This is why the story is still trending. It forces us to ask, what is my price? At what hour of hunger would I look at my best friend and see a calorie count? Today, you can hike the Donner Pass. There is a massive monument there. The pedestal is 22 feet high, the exact depth of the snow in 1846. Hikers report strange feelings of being watched. Some claim to hear the sound of a heavy wagon creaking through the trees when there is no wind. They say that in the winter, the air around the lake still carries a faint, sweet smell, the smell of cooking meat that shouldn't be there. Among the chaos, there was the Breen family. Patrick Breen was a man of deep faith, and unlike many others, he kept a daily diary during those 5 months of hell. His entries started with small complaints about the weather, but as the weeks turned into months, his handwriting began to change, becoming shaky and desperate. He wrote about the frozen silence. He described how the families would stay in their beds for days, not because they were tired, but because moving used too many calories. They were living in a state of biological hibernation. The Breens were one of the few families that didn't resort to cannibalism until the very last moment, surviving instead on the hides they had used to roof their cabins. Their story is a testament to the psychological power of hope, but even their hope had a breaking point when the last hide was boiled into nothingness. Let's talk about what was actually happening to their bodies. At -30 degrees, your blood begins to pull away from your skin to protect your vital organs. Your fingers and toes turn black as the tissue dies, frostbite in its most aggressive form. Many of the children in the Donner Party lost their toes before the first month was over. But the most dangerous part is the cold fog that settles in the brain. You lose the ability to reason. You make choices that a sane person would never make. This explains why some members wandered away from the fire, or why they couldn't remember the names of their own siblings. They weren't just starving, their brains were literally freezing in their skulls. Franklin Ward Billy Graves was a 57-year-old father who took his entire family into the mountains. During the trek of the Forlorn Hope, Billy knew he wouldn't make it. As he lay dying in the snow, he called his daughters to his side. He didn't give them a final blessing or a prayer. Instead, he gave them a command. He told them that as soon as his heart stopped beating, they must use his body to survive. He died so that they could eat. Can you imagine the trauma of that moment? A daughter having to carve into her own father because he ordered her to do so? This is the grit of the Donner story that history often glosses over. Tamsen Donner is perhaps the most tragic figure of the entire group. She was an intellectual, a teacher who brought books and art supplies for the school she wanted to start in California. When the first relief party arrived, they told her she could leave, but she refused. Her husband, George, had a hand so badly infected with gangrene that he couldn't move. Tamsen chose to stay and watch him die, even though she knew it was a death sentence for her too. Rumors circulated for years about what happened after the last rescue party left. Some say Tamsen was murdered by Louis Keseberg, the most hated man in the group, so that he could steal the Donner's hidden gold and eat her remains. Louis Keseberg was the last person to be rescued. When the fourth relief party found him in April, he was alone in a cabin filled with human remains. He was sitting in front of a pot of what he claimed was fresh liver. But there were no animals left. The rescuers were so disgusted that they threatened to hang him on the spot. Keseberg became a pariah in California. He sued for slander, but he only won $1. He lived the rest of his life in hiding, a man who had tasted the forbidden and could never return to society. One of the most searched topics on Google regarding the Donner Party is the lost Donner gold. The Donners were wealthy. They were carrying thousands of dollars in gold coins hidden in the false bottoms of their wagons. When the rescue parties arrived, the gold was gone. Did Keseberg steal it? Was it buried under a specific tree at Alder Creek that has since been lost to time? Treasure hunters still roam the Sierra Nevada today with metal detectors, looking for the currency of a dead family. In the 1990s and again in 2024, archaeological digs at the site revealed the true desperation of the camps. They found tiny fragments of bone, thousands of them. But these bones weren't just from humans, they were from the very dogs the children had played with weeks before. They also found jewelry, small porcelain dolls, and expensive combs. It shows that even as they were dying, they tried to hold on to their civilized identity. They kept their finery in the mud and snow, a silent protest against the animalistic reality they were forced to endure. American audiences are currently obsessed with the comparison between the Donner Party and the 1972 Andes flight disaster. Both involved cannibalism for survival. But there is a key difference. The Andes survivors had a sense of unity. The Donner Party had a sense of every family for themselves. This lack of cohesion is what led to the high death toll. It's a chilling lesson in social dynamics. When the group fails to share, everyone dies faster. How did they choose who to eat? At first, they only ate those who died of natural causes. They were careful to avoid eating their own kin. But as the starvation progressed, these rules evaporated. They began to eat the people they had known for years. They dried the meat to make it last. They even ate the brains and the marrow, the most nutrient-dense parts of the body. It was a mechanical, cold-blooded system of recycling human life to keep other lives going. When the news hit the California newspapers in 1847, it was the viral story of the century. It changed the way Americans looked at the West. It wasn't just a land of opportunity, it was a land of monsters. The Hastings cutoff was permanently abandoned. Lansford Hastings, the man who started it all, never apologized. He even tried to recruit more people for other dangerous routes. He was the original clickbait salesman, and his lies cost 42 people their lives. As the snow finally began to melt in the spring of 1847, the Sierra Nevada mountains revealed a landscape of pure horror. The rescue parties didn't just find bodies, they found the remnants of a struggle that the human mind isn't designed to comprehend. They found small, hand-carved toys scattered in the mud next to gnawed bones. They found letters that ended mid-sentence. The trees that the pioneers had cut high up, because they were standing on 20 feet of snow, remained as stump monuments for decades. These tall stumps were a silent, physical measurement of just how deep the trap had been. They served as a warning to anyone else who thought they could outsmart the mountains. Even today, the soil at the campsite has a different chemical composition. It is enriched with the calcium of those who never made it out. Survival is often a life sentence of its own.